Plenty of sunshine through the afternoon. Temperatures will be around or a little below average for this time of year, but feeling warmer in the sunshine. It will be a similar story for parts of northeast England, where there will be just a little fair weather cloud around at times. Tomorrow is set to be a little cloudier though. There will still be plenty of sunshine across Scotland this afternoon, with blue skies and very little cloud around. Most will have a light wind though, and it'll be breezy towards the northwest. There will also be lots of sunshine across Northern Ireland as we head through the afternoon. Here temperatures will get to around 8 Celsius and winds will remain light. The showers in the south will gradually die out, leaving a fine end to the day across the UK. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Join me and Nigel and Iman for the discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here. From big ideas to questions shaping the public conversation, we tackle the moral, cultural and political implications of news stories.
We need to share this conversation democratically.
It has become so toxic, this debate.
They relish this kind of discourse.
From fascinating guests to challenging ideas, you won't want to miss it. The discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here, GB News.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask. So why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for...
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to those of you watching on TV and listening on DAB radio. This is Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Today, I want to know, should Great Britain be more self-sufficient? We'll be talking sport, Gavin Williamson getting a knighthood, and my good friends at the Electoral Commission. It's going to be busy, but first, it's the news with Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you, Darren. Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. A second attempt to evacuate civilians from the city of Mariupol has failed amid continued Russian shelling. That's according to Ukraine's Interior Ministry. Evacuations were scheduled to begin at noon local time and last until 9 p.m. in the city. It follows the collapse of an agreed ceasefire yesterday for the same reason. Mariupol's mayor Vadim Boychenko says as many as 400,000 people are stuck in the southeastern city.
During the first days of the war, we counted the victims in tens. Today, we count them in hundreds, and in 2 days' time, we'll likely count them in thousands. They will not give us an opportunity to count the wounded and the killed, because the shelling has not stopped for the past 6 days.
The Ukrainian military are helping residents in the city of Irpin escape as heavy Russian shelling hit this morning. People were seen running as armed clashes in the area, some 15 miles from the capital, Kyiv, destroyed homes and buildings. Speaking earlier, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow will halt its operation in Ukraine if its demands are met. The Ministry of Defence is accusing Moscow of targeting populated areas in Ukraine. In an intelligence update, the MOD said Russia's bombardment is similar to tactics seen in Chechnya and Syria. Moscow denies it is targeting civilians. Analysts say the strength of Ukrainian resistance is slowing the Russian advance in the country. In a video address, President Zelensky appealed directly to Russian citizens.
We Ukrainians want peace. Citizens of Russia, for you, this is a struggle, not only for peace in Ukraine, this is a fight for your country, for the best it had, for the freedom that you have seen, for the wealth that you have felt. If you keep silent now, only your poverty will speak for you later, and only repression will answer. Do not be silent.
Well, over 1.5 million refugees have now left Ukraine for neighbouring countries over the last 10 days. The UN says it's the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Earlier, the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab warned the conflict in Ukraine is likely to last months, if not years. Former diplomatic reporter Nick Gowing told GBNews the humanitarian crisis is being used as a weapon of war by Putin.
We are now seeing Putin using the humanitarian reality of several million, if not maybe 10 or 15 million refugees within the next 2 or 3 weeks. 2 or 3 weeks. That has a massive destabilizing impact on many of the nations who are receiving them.
The Prime Minister is calling on world leaders to make a renewed effort to ensure President Putin fails. Boris Johnson has unveiled a 6-point plan, which ranges from humanitarian support to inflicting more economic pain on Moscow. President Putin says sanctions against Russia amount to declaring war. Mr. Johnson is due to host leaders from Canada, the Netherlands and Central Europe in London next week. Well, President Joe Biden says the US is ready to increase its support in Ukraine and toughen its sanctions against Russia. In a phone call with President Zelensky overnight, President Biden said he was working to secure extra funding to provide humanitarian and economic aid. The two also discussed increasing the economic sanctions imposed on Moscow. Speaking in Moldova, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken also announced security assistance.
We are we're looking actively now at the question of airplanes that Poland may provide to Ukraine, and looking at how we might be able to backfill should Poland decide to produce those supply those planes.
Visa and MasterCard are suspending all operations in Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. MasterCard says cards issued by Russian banks will no longer be supported by its network, and any card issued outside the country will not work at Russian stores or ATMs. The Visa chief executive says they've been compelled to act after the unacceptable events witnessed in Ukraine. And 2 brothers have won Team GB's first gold in the Winter Paralympics in Beijing. Skier Neil Simpson and his guide and brother Andrew topped the podium in the men's Super G vision impaired class. 19-year-old Neil is the first British male athlete to win a gold medal on snow. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Darren.
Welcome to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Thank you very much for your company and for joining on telly and DAB radio. Here's what's coming up on the show. Our energy security has been neglected for years. Now is the time to go for shale gas, increase British manufacturing and produce much more of our own food. We have to become as self-sufficient as a nation can be. Let's crack on and frack on. Do you agree? Should Great Britain be more self-sufficient? Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich has put the club up for sale. This is after, of course, the Russian owner was coming under increasing pressure due to the invasion taking place in Ukraine by Russia. Any net proceeds of the sale will go to support those affected by the war in Ukraine. Former Defence Secretary and Education Secretary Gavin Williamson is set to get a gong, a knighthood, folks. Number 10 admits knighthood for him is hard to justify. Quite extraordinary stuff, if you ask me. So today we'll be going back to basics on the British honour system. What is it and why does it exist? That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I'd love to know your thoughts. Should the UK become more self-sufficient, and how should we go about it? Tweet us at GBNews, or you can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can watch us online too on YouTube, and don't forget about Facebook. You'll find lots of brilliant content on the GB News page. Cheers very much. Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, you heard in the news there, has drawn up a 6-point plan that aims to end the horror of war in Ukraine and defeat Bad Vlad and the Russian Federation. It's a crisis that's transformed the Prime Minister from looking as though he'd be a one-hit wonder, frankly, with a massive election victory, only to lose it all over Partygate. He's now back again, folks, to being a man right for the moment, leading the global response, it has to be said, to that invasion with, I think, the clarity of purpose and a nation united behind him. Quite remarkable scenes, actually. No one thought that was coming. Certainly the Remainers didn't predict it. That's why I think it's time for the Prime Minister to make the case that the dangers this nation has faced, the coronavirus pandemic, and now the threat of nuclear holocaust with a territory seizing Russia, mean it's time to get serious on bolstering our self-reliance as a nation. We don't, in my view, grow enough, build enough, or rely on ourselves enough, because we're not able to. We found out during the pandemic that we're much too reliant upon Chinese supply chains. China lied and people died, yet we're still totally dependent on them for our everyday goods. We're now finding out during this war that we're much too reliant on others for our energy needs and even our food supply. Isn't it time that we look to bolster Britain's production of such important things? Nigel Farage and Richard Tice of Reform UK have actually been making the case and launching the Vote Power Not Poverty campaign, a cross-party campaign for a net zero referendum. A campaign that I reckon could be as electorally disastrous for the Prime Minister as the EU referendum was for David Cameron. Of course, Nigel Farage played a pretty big role in bringing that about as well. My 6-point plan, folks, were I to have one, would go something a little like this. First of all, the Prime Minister ought to reverse the ban on fracking, the extraction of shale gas. We know that there's a golden opportunity, a rich seam of high-quality gas that can be used to heat our homes and power our economy. It means high-quality, high-skilled jobs right here in Blighty. Our economy is said to be hobbled by the extraordinary increase in the price of gas. Just have a look at these stats from the Spectator magazine's data section. Surely you cannot look at this. You cannot imagine the harm that these prices are going to cause. You cannot not imagine the businesses that are going to go under with the costs this high, and conclude that pursuing net zero and cementing, which is what's going to happen, folks, cementing over our fracking sites is a sensible thing to do. Boris, I say to you, come on, mate, it's time to get frack on track. Frack to our greener future. Or fracking hell, folks, are we in for one hell of a ride? Even Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla Motors, the world's most successful electric car entrepreneur, has called on leaders to increase oil and gas output immediately. He says that extraordinary times demand extraordinary measures. despite the fact that this would, of course, negatively impact his electric car company. He warns that we cannot immediately make up for Russian oil and gas exports. Secondly, I'd stop the closure of coal power plants. Controversial, I know, but we need to accept that we need to elongate the bridge to that greener, cleaner Britain. The West is at war, right? We cannot afford to force our nation to choose between heating and eating at this time, or frankly ever. Thirdly, that means that we need to delay the Prime Minister's net zero by 2050 target, this arbitrary target that I think binds our hands and asphyxiates our legislative flexibility on everything from a hit to our economy to rules and regulations. Fourth, I'd scrap foreign aid. It's quite clear to me that we ought to be spending less money on projects like the Ethiopian Spice Girls, remember that one, or on sending that money to those who are allying themselves with either China or Russia, when we ought to be ensuring that Her Majesty's armed forces are able to defend our nation from the series of threats that we now face in an increasingly dangerous world. And that segues nicely into my fifth ask. I'd spend way more dosh on building and expanding our military recruits. I'd scrap the Prime Minister's proposed tax rises and the green taxes on our energy bills. We ought to be going for growth to attract business and create access to opportunities, whilst alleviating the burden on households that are letting out a collective gasp as they open their energy bills through these weeks and months. The West is at war, right? It's about time that we took that as seriously as I put it and put in place a plan to deal with it. People need help, and they need it now. They don't need lofty sound bites about how a country that emits a mere 1% of global CO2 emissions is going green. So my final point of action is just that, action. And that's my 6-point plan, folks. The time's 2:13. Now let's hear from some real voices. I'll shut me gob for a minute, shall I? Does Britain need to be more self-sufficient? That's the question we've been asking in Sheffield.
Yes, I think we should be more self-sufficient, and we're importing 70% of our food, and I think that it's a waste of resources to have to import. And not only that, why shouldn't we have a good farming system that can provide for the country? Why are we importing things that could be cultivated here?
Because it will help the environment more, and it's good to move away from CO2 emissions, stuff like that. Yeah.
I think being self-sufficient allows us to use our produce and use the environment better. I think if we're self-sufficient, we're using less resources, and that's the key for the next 50 years. If we can use less resources, then we should be therefore more self-sufficient. Better use of land for produce, better diets, better understanding of what we should and shouldn't be eating, so that we eat the right foods that we can produce locally rather than anything coming from abroad or relying on foreign cheaper foods.
Absolutely, it should be more self-sufficient, because we're relying on so many other countries right now for everything, and every country needs to be self-sufficient as far as I'm concerned. And I'm from Canada originally, and same thing there. Everything comes from everywhere else, and how are we going to survive? All the food products, all the any kind of fuels, it needs to come from within.
Because of the present crisis with Russia, we can't rely on other countries, so we need to provide our own electricity, gas and food to keep the price down.
People in Sheffield there having their say, fascinating stuff. We're going to continue that discussion in our Culture Row segment, and here to discuss whether Britain needs to be more self-sufficient is the political commentator Suzanne Evans and Matthew Lesh, the head of public policy at the Institute for Economic Affairs. Suzanne, I'll start with you. Can you just set out in 30 seconds your stall on why Britain needs to be more self-sufficient?
Look, nobody wants to close Britain off from the rest of the world. That's clearly not what anyone's saying here. But I think what we've seen throughout the COVID pandemic, when supply chains were so brutally disrupted, what we've seen throughout this war in Ukraine, where we're looking at a situation where Russia and Ukraine together provide 60% of the world's food and 30% of the world's wheat. And obviously that's very much a staple in the Western world. And I look at our country when we are importing a significant proportion of our food, and only 1.3% of the country actually works in food production, in farming and fishing. There's something wrong here. I think we, as I say, we don't want to close ourselves off, but surely being more self-sufficient in terms of energy and food, two of the most fundamentally important things in all our lives, that's got to be a no-brainer, surely.
Matthew, surely Suzanne's talking absolute common sense, and you heard there in the package from Sheffield that people agree, the general consensus is that people agree with Suzanne.
Look, trade provides consumers with a far greater array of products at much lower prices, and means the British economy can specialise, which results in us doing higher value chain and higher paid jobs. It means that we're able to share knowledge across the world. It means we're more innovative. The alternative is not some magical world in which Britain can produce everything itself. It actually would have quite disastrous consequences if we start reducing our dependence on trade. It would mean substantially high prices for consumers. Let's say if we had less food imports, it would actually make it more risky, not less risky, because what ensures the security of food supply is not all being self-sufficient, it's actually the diversity of supply chains. There's a risk that if there's a bad crop here in Britain and we've only got British food, that you could actually have starvation and shortages of food. Instead, what we can do is if there's a shortage in one place, we can get food from other places. And that's what really the global economy provides us. It's provided us extraordinary prosperity, it's lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, and it's ensured that we live much better, more prosperous lives that are extraordinarily positive for people right across the country. And I think, although in theory some people might say, well, we should be more self-sufficient, if people actually saw the consequences of that in terms of the cost of foods or the limited availability of food that would come, you would have to fight back against that.
And Suzanne, your point there would be that surely we need to do this right now at this moment. You mentioned Ukraine there, energy bills going absolutely sky high. I've spoken earlier about the collective gasp of the nation there when they open their energy bills. That's the sort of thing that we need to be focusing on, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the charity National Energy Action suggested this week that fuel bills for the average household might reach £3,000 by October if this crisis continues, if the Ukrainian crisis continues. And that's going to put another 8.5 million people into poverty, potentially. So whilst I totally agree, I mean, I don't disagree with Matthew. I'd be the first person to say that international trade is vitally important. It absolutely lifts people out of poverty. I'm a firm believer in trade, not development aid, actually is the way forward in terms of creating a more secure planet, both politically, economically, and in terms of our overall interaction with each other. But the fact is, what I'm talking about here is basic infrastructure. I think to put ourselves in a position where, as I say, we are heavily reliant on foreign energy and foreign food is not a sustainable way to live. It's not about trade in luxury goods. It's not about trade in those non-essentials. It's not about the stuff that we don't need. It's about that basic infrastructure. And of course, the government's already had to learn a pretty hard lesson here, hasn't it? In the wake of China's behavior over Taiwan, the noises it's making on the border with India, the news that we had out of Wuhan, they've had to kick China out of the 5G network, Hinkley Point, the nuclear power station. China's now had to leave. My argument would have been we should never have been so heavily reliant on China in the first place. Then we wouldn't have come to that pass. It's about basic infrastructure. It's not about overall trade. It's about those fundamentals that are so important to us here and everyone's lives.
Matthew, do you want to respond to that then? Because actually Suzanne's making the case there that being more dependent on international trade and people, sort of global actors that aren't acting, in my opinion, in good faith, like China or indeed Russia, making ourselves dependent on states like that is actually dangerous to national security.
Look, I think that there's a genuine point to be made about where Britain is limiting production. So as you've said, Darren, it doesn't make any sense to stop fracking, and we should absolutely allow prospecting in Britain. I think that would be great for the British economy, and it would ensure a greater gas supply. But we have to be realistic here. If we started fracking today, it's not going to have much impact in the short run, and it's probably not going to supply our entire energy needs. And what would be a more short-term fix would be increasing production of liquefied natural gas in the US, in Australia, potentially in Qatar as well, and having the infrastructure to be able to ship that into Europe to make them less dependent on Russia. None of that means reducing international trade. I think it just means ensuring we have a diversity of supply chains. And there's a very strong argument that Europe, particularly a country like Germany, has become excessively dependent on Russian oil and Russian gas. Overall, though, I don't think that says much about the general benefits we get from free trade and the great opportunities it provides to humanity. China is obviously another challenging issue here, where we don't want to be excessively dependent on one nation. And we're already seeing businesses doing this. We're seeing businesses diversifying their supply chains away from China, right across Southeast Asia. There's increasing activity going on in Africa. We can benefit from all that. We can benefit from the trade without necessarily saying that trade hurts us, because I think trade provides great benefits to humanity.
Well, folks, thank you very much. That's Suzanne Evans and Matthew Lesh joining me there on Real Britain for that really important debate. Plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain. This week it was announced that Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich has decided to sell the club. He's owed 1.5 billion quid of loans from the club, but he won't be asking for any of it back, apparently. Must be nice, eh? But before we get into that, let's have a look at that weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK's looking fine and dry for most of us, but turning chilly under clear skies. Let's take a look at those details. After a fairly cloudy afternoon, there'll be some clear spells this evening across the southwest of England, especially in the east of this region, feeling a little chilly. Further east, it will remain dry this evening with cloudier skies to the south of London, keeping a frost at bay, clearer to the north. For Wales, it will be a chilly and cloudy evening, though clearer skies closer to the west coast will mean an early frost will develop. For the Midlands, it will be dry for all this evening, clear skies across the west coast with a frost here. Further inland, a little mild under the cloudier skies, but still feeling chilly. Across the northeast of England, many will see clear and starry skies this evening, which by morning will mean there will be a widespread frost with lows of -4 degrees Celsius. Similarly, across Scotland, most will see a clear, calm and frosty night. Though closer to the coast, it should stay just above freezing, with a stronger breeze in the west. Northern Ireland will also see a dry and clear night, though it will be a little breezy, which means that frost will be restricted to sheltered, low-lying areas. Another dry and fine day on Monday across the UK, with the best of the sunshine across the north once again. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Anaya Falar and Iman, for the discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here. From big ideas to questions shaping the public conversation, we tackle the moral, cultural and political implications of news stories.
We need to share this conversation democratically.
It has become so toxic, this debate.
They relish this kind of discourse.
From fascinating guests to challenging ideas, you won't want to miss it. The discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here, GB News.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Cheers very much for your company. Now, the world of sport has been rocked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Roman Abramovich has confirmed he's selling Chelsea Football Club, and all net proceeds from that sale will be donated to the victims of the war in Ukraine. Justin Allen joins me now. He's a sports writer for The Sun. And basically, Justin, do you think Roman Abramovich had absolutely no choice but to put the club up for sale?
Yeah, I think you're right, Darren. I think absolutely no choice. It's quite clear that the government are now going after him. We're in a situation at the moment where they're carrying out due process. I find it a little bit baffling that you might have heard Boris Johnson say that one of the reasons why they haven't seized any of his assets at the moment is because they might face an army of lawyers. They've got to make sure everything's watertight. It seems incredible. Could you imagine in a time of crisis, like, for example, the Second World War, Winston Churchill not being able to seize German assets or intern German nationals because due process wasn't being followed? What I think they should do, if you know, it's found that Roman Abramovich has got questionable ties to Vladimir Putin, that they should legislate so that assets can be at least frozen or suspended, because what's actually happening now, he's actually going through the sale of the club, and that could all be completed by the time they carry out their due process.
Yeah, I mean, we hear this so much, don't we, about the fact that the government is absolutely unable to do anything, whether it be what's going on at the English Channel. We just can't act because it get caught up in legalese and all the rest of it. It is utterly insane. But what did you actually make of the decision for Chelsea to, or rather for Abramovich really, to come out and say all proceeds will be going to this war in Ukraine? Is this damage control?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's obviously fantastic PR to say that. I mean, it would have been a lot better had he come out and perhaps condemned Putin for his illegal invasion of Ukraine. I suspect, though, that would play very well in Russia, and that would literally put a target on his head. But no, I think, well, it's certainly the right thing to, I think it's the profits that he's going to donate to the victims of the people that are fleeing the war. So, it's damage limitation, definitely, and it's obviously good PR for him. And it sort of doesn't tarnish his legacy at Chelsea, because he's obviously had unprecedented success there.
Yeah, I mean, what did you make of the Chelsea fans singing his name at the match yesterday? Do you think there's a real sense of, a tribal sense of loyalty for him? Because, of course, the club has gone from strength to strength under his chairmanship of the club.
Yeah, I mean, John Terry got into a bit of trouble. I don't know if you saw his tweet. He tweeted a picture of him with Roman Abramovich with the Premier League trophy, saying the best. But look, listen, when he took over that club, they were pretty much, an half-decent Premier League team. I remember that when they used to be yo-yoing between the top two divisions. But under his stewardship, they've won 19 major pieces of silverware. I was actually having a debate with a friend the other day. You could say that they're the most successful club over the last decade, because although Manchester City have won 5 Premier League titles to Chelsea's 2, they've been phenomenal on the world stage. I mean, they've won 2 Champions Leagues in the last decade, 2 Europa Leagues, 2 European Super Cups, and very recently the FIFA World Club Championship as well. It's just unprecedented success, and you can understand why fans and former players show loyalty to him.
Justin, can I ask you a question? And I say this, I realise, as a fan of Newcastle United, so I should probably shut my mouth as soon as possible. But do you think, actually, there's a lot of talk, of course, it was in the Levelling Up white paper, indeed, about the need for a football regulator. Do you think that, given there's probably a line of billionaires ready to swoop in and buy Chelsea, do you actually think that this regulator needs to be brought about to actually properly scrutinise foreign takeovers of some of what are the biggest clubs in the most popular league in the world?
I absolutely agree with you on that, 100%. I mean, football has got a bad reputation of attracting the wrong sort of people. I mean, there was a fantastic article I read this morning, actually, in the Sunday Times, Rod Liddle, because when an owner takes over a club, they have to pass something called the fit and proper test. It's in the Premier League, it's in the EFL. But to be honest with you, Rod articulated it beautifully this morning by saying it's useless. It's you know their test. I think Adolf Hitler or Ronnie Biggs could pass it. It's so poor. I think it needs to be regulated where, I mean, one of the clubs that we've just lost recently, Bury Football Club, is very well documented. They went out of the league. They're just reforming, and they're going under a model that is used widespread in Germany, which is a 51-49 system. So what that means is 51% of the club is fan-owned, with the other 49% being made up of investors. So the fans always stay in control of the club, because all our clubs, they're institutions, they are the centre of their communities. You know, these teams...
Oh, absolutely. He's absolutely right there, Justin, that clubs are at the heart of communities. We're lost in there. But Justin Allen, sports writer for The Sun, thank you very much for your time. You're with GB News on telly and DAB radio. Still to come on Real Britain, back to basics. We'll get at the bottom of the honours system, who gets honoured and why. Now, it's time for a check on the news headlines with Olivia Guthrie.
Thank you. It's 2:33. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. A second attempt to evacuate civilians from the city of Mariupol has failed amid continued Russian shelling. That's according to Ukraine's Interior Ministry. Evacuations were scheduled to begin at noon local time and last until 9 p.m. It follows the collapse of an agreed ceasefire yesterday in 2 areas of the country. Mariupol's mayor, Vadim Boychenko, says as many as 400,000 people are stuck in the southeastern city.
During the first days of the war, we counted the victims in tens. Today, we count them in hundreds, and in 2 days' time, we'll likely count them in thousands. They will not give us an opportunity to count the wounded and the killed, because the shelling has not stopped for the past 6 days.
The US Secretary of State says there are very credible reports of deliberate attacks on civilians by Russian forces in Ukraine. Antony Blinken says Washington was documenting the reports to establish if war crimes have been committed. It follows the Ministry of Defense here accusing Moscow of targeting populated areas. Russia denies it's targeting civilians. The Ukrainian military are helping residents in the city of Irpin escape amid heavy Russian shelling. Earlier, people were seen running as armed clashes in the area destroyed homes and buildings. Speaking earlier, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow will halt its operation in Ukraine if its demands are met. In the last hour, Ukraine's president said a civilian airport in the city of Vinnytsia had been destroyed by Russian missiles. Over 1.5 million refugees have now left Ukraine for neighbouring countries over the last 10 days. The UN says it's the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Earlier, the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab warned the conflict in Ukraine is likely to last months, if not years. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. We'll be back to Real Britain with Darren Grimes after this short break.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Cheers very much for your company. Now, hundreds of thousands of people are gathering across the world today to protest the invasion of Ukraine. The world continues to express shock at Putin's devastating invasion, and those scenes that we saw in the news there, I think, are harrowing indeed, including, of course, in London, plus many other British towns and cities. One of those places where people are protesting is Nottingham, where our reporter Will Hollis joins us now. Will, the protest started at midday. How's it going now?
Good afternoon, Darren. Yeah, this protest today in Nottingham to stand with Ukraine in line with a day of global action has now started to really quieten down. There are a few people that have remained still to talk about the issue, because the issue isn't going away despite the need for people to start to go home and go back to what they have to do today. Yeah, there was about 300, 400 people here today in Nottingham in line with various different days of action where people from regular walks of life, whether they're from Ukrainian or Russian society or just local people from Nottingham, expressing their views at the utter disgust at what's going on in a sovereign nation like Ukraine today.
And what are people actually saying to you that you've spoken to? Because, you know, there have been incidents like this, wars, invasions that have happened before, which haven't actually got people out onto the streets. What are people saying that's got them so animated?
Yeah, well, there are, in a city like Nottingham, protests do happen quite frequently. It is quite a politically charged part of the country, no matter where you sit. I think that a lot of people are really feeling this, even if you aren't somebody that would naturally protest in a place like Nottingham, because they are seeing what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in mainland Europe, the biggest invasion of a European country and the biggest conflict on mainland European soil since the invasion of Poland, Czechoslovakia, as we saw in the Second World War by Adolf Hitler. Now, some of the conversations that I've been having with people who have family that are in Ukraine right now, whether they're distant relatives, cousins, aunties, uncles, or even their grandparents, are that they are really worried for the family and friends that are out there. I met a young man who was probably a similar age to me, in his mid-20s, who said that he wakes up in the morning and the first thing he does is to check his phones to see if anyone has said that they're going to be bombed that night, if they're in a bomb shelter and they're having to say goodbye to their best friends. This is one Ukrainian man who was really worried about what happens in the 8 or so hours that he might go to sleep, because he doesn't know whether his friends will be alive in the morning. And this is the regular occurrence for people that are living inside of Ukraine. They very much are going to sleep at night unsure as to whether their bomb shelter or their home or wherever they think might be safe for that night, whether it'll be the thing that protects them in the morning. So lots of people here in Nottingham, as well as many other cities. You mentioned London there, where we are seeing thousands of people in the streets, but it's not just Britain, British streets. Obviously this is GB News, Britain's news channel, but we're seeing these images from around the world in places like Cologne, in places like Berlin, in other Western countries, America, Australia, New Zealand, where people are standing up and saying that we do stand with the Ukrainian people, and what's happening in Russia right now with the Russian invasion is something that we completely do not agree with and will stand against.
And we're seeing the visuals of flags, people flying flags. People have created, Ukraine-themed posters and all sorts. It's really is, I think, an outpouring of support. We've got Stop the War banners and all sorts going on there. And actually, it looks like a fair number of people actually turned out to actually say, well, enough is enough. We've got to stand up for this, because if you can, as you rightly say, Will, just march into a country the size of France and, take your pick of whatever it is, whatever parts of it you want, which looks like the full thing, who says Putin's going to stop there, right? That's the worry. That's what people, I think, are so animated by at the minute. But Will Hollis in Nottingham, thank you very much for that really important update. Now let's hear what you in Britain have had to say about whether or not the UK should be more self-sufficient. Dennis has been in touch to actually say an independent Scotland would be self-sufficient in food, water and energy, with enough left to export to friendly neighbours. Well, I don't know what sort of what dream that would actually look like, because a self-sufficient and independent Scotland would obviously have to run in that big budget deficit that it is. It's borrowing a lot of money. What are they going to do? They're going to have to borrow lots of money, and that means debt, debt, debt. Lillian says the EU wanted to ensure that no state within the EU was self-reliant. That was one of its ways of control. Unfortunately, we allowed too many foreign powers control of our utilities, transport and food production. Clive said, as a country, we don't make as much as we used to, and will always be cheaper to buy things made in Asia. This is due to the lower wages and the need to import raw materials. I can't see Brexit changing that. On Facebook, Mandy put together a list for us saying, support British farmers, good welfare standards, less air/road miles, more green fields, countryside management and fresh produce. Alison puts it simply and says, it's time to kickstart British manufacturing again. And the last comment for now is from Stephen, who said, having good trade deals with our Commonwealth countries and a strong navy might just work. Do you think Britain should be more self-sufficient? Keep those emails, those tweets and Facebook comments coming in, please, because they're fascinating indeed. It's 2:43, and today's Back to Basics will be learning all about the honours system. The former Defence Secretary and Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, is set to receive a knighthood. He famously, of course, told Russia to shut up before it was popular. The decision for him to have this honour has faced plenty of criticism. Mr. Williamson has not commented so far on this honour. Here to discuss, I'm joined by Dr. David Jeffrey, British politics lecturer at the University of Liverpool. David, clear it up for us then. What actually is the honours system?
So the honours system is essentially a way of rewarding British citizens or anybody from 15 other Commonwealth states for service to art, entertainment, to the nation, in the case of Gavin Williamson, allegedly. Service broadly defined. And we can think of this in two ways. So one is kind of political honours, so appointment to the House of Lords, and the other is a broader one where we think of maybe people who are rewarded with a CBE or an OBE.
Now, come on, everyone's saying it, aren't they, that actually Gavin Williamson didn't deserve a gong. He was a pretty poor education secretary, not exactly great at much else in government, and people are saying this was just used as a tool to shut him up.
Well, I mean, I don't have any special insight into the motivations of say, the Prime Minister or Gavin Williamson, but it is not beyond the realms of possibility that that is the case, right? So the Queen does have a role in this system, and there is an informal oversight from Her Majesty's office, but most of this is done within the Cabinet Office. So the checks that are done are around financial probity, around donations, around criminal records. But essentially, it is completely possible for the Cabinet Office and, by extension, the Prime Minister to grant an honour to somebody if they so wish. And it has been alleged that this was perhaps one of the prices that Gavin Williamson extracted by going quietly when he was sacked.
Exactly. I wonder if that spider he keeps in his office allegedly has something to do with it, maybe. But does this system, when did this system actually start? Because a lot of people are saying that actually there's been whilst it was laudable to begin with, there's been a sort of corruption element of the honest system, and now it's just used to either, give a little gong to political allies, opponents, and all the rest of it.
Well, I mean, the honest system has been with us for a long time. I think the 14th century was when the concept of knights first came about under, I think, Edward II. I was put on the spot there. But more recently, this is not a recent complaint that these honours have been politically manipulated. I mean, it was long the case that MPs who lost a seat, and not often very impressive MPs, were given a seat in the House of Lords. This has happened for centuries. Similarly, Harold Wilson, in his second resignation honours list, faced a huge barrage of complaints because of some of the appointments he made. It was known as the Lavender List and included quite a few eccentric figures, including the man who owned the company that made Harold Wilson's favourite coats, and people end up going to prison for fraud and things like that. So this has always been quite a controversial element of the British system. But I mean, there's also good sides to it, right? People who do very, very worthy work also get rewarded. And there has been some attempts over time to professionalise it, to make it a more robust system. But there will always be that element of political reward for some people.
Exactly, and of course we should celebrate and actually give honours to those who have done incredibly laudable, worthy things for this nation and, well, in the name of this nation indeed. But when you have Sir Keir Starmer, for example, this morning calling for the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee to look into a decision to grant Russian-born media mogul Lord Lebedev a peerage, essentially, do you actually worry that what we're doing here is making the public just feel that most people don't deserve these honours? And isn't that quite sad, actually?
Well, I think in that case, I mean, personally, I don't really see what he had done to deserve being elevated to our legislature. So, I mean, a knighthood is, you get Sir in front of your name. That's quite a nice title. It doesn't allow you to vote on laws. A peerage is a completely different process, and that is a political process by definition. And as someone who thinks we should reduce the size of the House of Lords, it does seem like that was a strange decision to make. But I think that you're right. We should be looking quite carefully at how we award these honours, and we shouldn't perhaps turn it into a post hoc political football match between, well, you've made this person appear, I don't like them. You make this, but let's investigate it. I think that would kind of tarnish the whole system.
Exactly. And David, I think actually the system, we need to look at reforming the system. We absolutely do, because I think actually being able to honour people for, as I say, really laudable things is a worthwhile pursuit in Her Majesty the Queen's name, of course. But I think we're at risk of losing public support in the honest system. So Dr. David Jeffrey, thank you very much for your time this afternoon and for putting that to rest. Now, GB News presenter Nigel Farage is launching a movement to campaign for a referendum on net zero. He's launched the idea with leader of the Reform Party, Richard Tice. It's a cross-party team, and they're calling themselves Vote Power, Not poverty. Dr. Benny Pizer is the director of Net Zero Watch, and he joins me now. Benny, would you actually welcome a referendum on net zero? Do you think once the public are presented with the facts, which I assume you would argue we haven't been so far, that the public would turn around and say, you know what, Benny, I think you're absolutely right, this is madness, I'm having naught to do with it?
Hi, Darren. First of all, we're a very broad church, so our members have different views on whether or not a referendum is the right idea. We certainly welcome the increased debate about the cost of net zero and the craziness of some of these targets. But we will also support all debates on the referendum without having an official position or campaigning for the referendum. We welcome the growing concern, we welcome the growing discussion.
Yeah, and in highlighting that discussion and that growing concern, Nigel Farage says that the political class in Westminster has actually taken the country down a ruinous path, and we've not been given a say over this. Now, of course, we heard the same argument in the EU referendum. Do you actually see it going a similar way on this debate around net zero?
Well, what I think where the similarities are is that the Conservative Party have turned their party into a green movement. And Boris, if he isn't careful, risks becoming Theresa May in trousers by essentially, taking a lot of their voters who are struggling to keep their homes warm and to pay the bills for granted. And voters will essentially vote the Conservatives out if they're not careful and are not responding to public objection to these very, very expensive policies.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the expense of these policies, how much in your view, and I realise I'm asking you to be a bit of a clairvoyant here because the predictions they range from wild to even wilder, but how much would it actually cost to decarbonise the entire British economy by that arbitrary target of 2050?
Well, it absolutely depends on how you go about. The problem with this government is that they are putting almost all their eggs into renewables, which are, absolutely costly and unreliable, instead of using our own domestic gas and shale gas and nuclear energy, which would be a much better option. And that is the choice the government now has to take. Either, play into Putin's hands and shut down all, prospects of all our huge shale gas resources and hand him basically the whole energy war. I mean, the government is absolutely mad in that they are still doing business as usual, as if nothing has happened. And nothing is happening in Europe, nothing is happening in Ukraine. We have to get our own resources out of the ground, and that will make us a much greener and cheaper economy and will help us in our struggle with Russia.
Yes, I mean, I want a greener, cleaner planet. I just don't want to ask people to have to choose between heating and eating their homes. I don't think that that's too wild an ask. Absolutely. But actually, I think we're going the same way that Australia did, where in the last general election, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, wasn't supposed to win that election, right? Labour were polling quite highly. And then Labour turned around and said, well, actually, you're going to lose your jobs because we're going to put in place these green taxes and all the rest of it on mining communities. And mining communities said, well, hang on a minute, mate. You ain't taking my job away. And I can sort of see in this country, we are starting to see the seeds of a similar debate happening. Do you actually see that as well?
Not really. Not for the time being. It might happen. For the time being, Boris sounds like Greta Thunberg, not like Scott Morrison. And he takes part of his voters for granted. And I think Nigel Farage's new campaign could undo a lot of what Boris did with Brexit. You remember, Boris only became prime minister because Theresa May messed up the whole Brexit negotiations. And Boris is at risk of repeating her mistake by taking his supporters and his voters for granted at a time when people are struggling to pay their bills. And unless he comes up with a clear proposal and a clear policy that eases the pain.
Exactly, and right now there isn't that infrastructure to put net zero in place without asking people to immiserate themselves and roll back progress. I agree with you. Benny Pizer, thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Thank you very much, so much for your company. The show's on every Saturday and Sunday at 2 p.m, but for now, I'll leave you with the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK's looking fine and dry for most of us, but turning chilly under clear skies. Let's take a look at those details. After a fairly cloudy afternoon, there'll be some clear spells this evening across the southwest of England, especially in the east of this region, feeling a little chilly. Further east, it will remain dry this evening with cloudier skies to the south of London, keeping a frost at bay, clearer to the north. For Wales, it will be a chilly and cloudy evening, though clearer skies closer to the west coast will mean an early frost will develop. For the Midlands, it will be dry for all this evening, clear skies across the west coast with a frost here. Further inland, a little mild under the cloudier skies, but still feeling chilly. Across the northeast of England, many will see clear and starry skies this evening, which by morning will mean there will be a widespread frost with lows of -4 degrees Celsius. Similarly, across Scotland, most will see a clear, calm and frosty night, though closer to the coast it should stay just above freezing with a stronger breeze in the west. Northern Ireland will also see a dry and clear night, though it will be a little breezy, which means that frost will be restricted to sheltered, low-lying areas. Another dry and fine day on Monday across the UK, with the best of the sunshine across the north once again. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Nana Akweer, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone. We learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on